Welcome this evening to our session at the Aguda Virtual Convention entitled COVID Perspectives, Real Life Lessons from Those Who Went Through It. And we all know for the past 9 months, it's hard to believe we have been living through Tekufas HaKovid. It's hard to believe that the Siyum HaShas was less than a year ago when we all sat together. And this is a journey that we've all taken. But some people have taken that journey even more. Some people who have been suffering, who have been sick, and Baruch Hashem have recovered. And we all go through a Tekufa where we're changed and we see things differently. But those who went through it see things very differently. And especially when they're Rabbanim, Chashav Rabbanim, who take a look at the Ruchnius of it. It's very interesting in the Sedras of Sefer Bereshis, we find two different types of Sedras. The first psukim of Sedras, we find Parshas Lech Lecha, this week Parshas Vayetze, where Hashem says, we're going, we're doing. And there are other Sedras which start with V'hu Yoshe Pesach HaOhel, Vayeshev Yaakov, where they're sitting. So sometimes our mission is to go out into the world and to change things, to influence people, to bring Kedusha everywhere. And there are other times when the Avodah of a Yid is to sit in one place, to reflect, to perhaps improve relationships with his family, to have time for his family, for his spouse, for the Ribbono Shel Olam, for himself. And each one HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us is important in each of those times in our life. So as we're now in the time of yeshiva, of thinking, of reflecting, it is very chashuv for us that we'll be hearing these two Rabbanim give us their insight. Our first speaker will be Harav Chaim Aryeh Zev Ginsburg of the Chafetz Chaim Torah Center of Cedarhurst. Rav Ginsburg is somebody who has spoken at many Agudas Yisrael conventions and has written extensively on a wide range of Torah topics. It is a great zchus for us to have him speak for us tonight and share his thoughts, his insights, and his inspiration.
A good tovach. Just want to make a reference that any chizuk that comes from my few words that I'm going to speak should be a schus zecher nishmas Sorachaya Shalom Basar Bar Yezev. My daughter, whose yahrzeit comes out just in a few days on Sunday, Yud Gimel Kislev. We read last week in Parshas Toldos two different opposite reactions to the death and the petira of passing of Avram Avinu. We saw that Yaakov Avinu prepared the Sudas Avelim, with its symbolism of life and the acceptance of the Dayan HaEmes. Esav, on the other hand, saw the death of this great tzaddik, Avram Avinu, as a reason to conclude that Chas v'Sholom les din v'les dayan. The same action, the same patira, the same passing of a beloved grandfather, and yet two different reactions from accepting the Dayan HaEmes to Chas v'Sholom les din v'les dayan. And whenever there is an impossible to comprehend situation, a tzara in Klal Yisrael, there has to be the reaction of Yaakov Avinu, to be able to accept the gzeir that it's from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to recognize that it's from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to strengthen ourselves in Emunah. This topic is about COVID, this terrible pandemic that has taken the entire world by storm and has affected not only Klal Yisrael but the entire world. But I sit here as a survivor. Most of you know my story. I became very, very ill on a life support machine, a ventilator, with failings. All my major systems failed. In a coma for 3 weeks, in the hospital for 6.5 weeks. And I'm standing here today, Baruch Hashem, a walking nace, a walking miracle. Put in perspective that we went from my wife receiving a call to come say goodbye to me, that I have a few hours left, to the recognition that I was the only one who, Baruch Hashem, walked out of the ICU. An open miracle. A nes goli. And nothing to do with my schusim, but only the schus of the tefillos of Klal Yisrael. And the power of tefillah. For myself, the lesson from COVID is very simple. When you're reborn, when the Eibishter gives you back your neshama, everything is different. Modani is different. The sunrise is different. I still remember when I came home, one of the first days that we came home, it was raining in the morning, and I heard the raindrops against the window, banging against the window, making noise. And I remember how beautiful that sound was. A sound that I don't think I ever noticed before. To recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me back my neshama, and what am I going to do with it? How am I going to keep the recognition, the feeling of uniqueness, recognizing the nace, that every moment should count. In the longer urine, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give me Ad Mei V'Yashrim Shana. There is no guarantee that one will be able to continue focusing on this great nace as you move on, as the days go further, in the weeks and the months. I remember the late Rosh Yeshiva from Tel Chicago, Chaim Dov Keller, Zechron Tzadik Livracha, once said it so well. When he said it in Kelm, they used to refer to Nisim as a kelbin hispilus, the hispilus of a cow. What does that mean? And he said, he gave an example. When you're you're going down a country road, quiet, all there are fields and cows on the side of the road, and it's quiet, and all of a sudden, an 18-wheeler truck flying down the road, and the tire blows, and it backfires, and there's a boom. And the cow, busy grazing with its head down, stops, is startled, lift up his head, looks around and puts his head back and continues eating. He says, we're like that kelbin hispilus. We experience nisim, we see nisim every single day, and some days more than others. And yet we go back to the way we were before. It's nothing more than a kelbin hispilus. I remember many years ago, Rav Shlomo Brevda, Zechron Tzadik Livracha, was speaking in Yerushalayim, giving a Musar Shmuz, and I went to hear him. And he said over an incredible insight of the Chazon Ish that to me was a life changer. He said over a story that he was a young yeshiva bacher in 1948, when the War of Independence was going on, and he was in Yerushalayim, and often at night when there would be a plane flying over, there would be a blackout. All the lights would go off. And he remembers walking from his relative's home where he would have his meals, walking back to yeshiva, and all of a sudden the blackout was pitch black. And he continued walking because he felt he knew the way to go, he knew the route very well. And then all of a sudden he remembered that it was at one point on the normal path that he takes, there's a drop-off, there's a cliff, a very dangerous cliff. And he stopped, and he was trying to get his bearing straight. Where is he in relation to that drop? And he stopped, and he was standing there thinking, where is he? Trying to get his bearings, and all of a sudden the lights went on, and he saw that his foot was right at the end of the cliff. The next step he would have taken would have been the last step that he would have ever taken. And he was shook up incredibly, as we all would be. And the next morning when he came to yeshiva to daven, he had a regular Shmona Esrei, no difference in the day before. The inspiration was gone. The deep need to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Modem Anachnu, thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for what you had done. Anisecha Shabachol Yom. You expected that he would have an incredible intensive tefillah. And yet, it was the same as any other day. And it troubled him so that he went to the bus station and took a bus to Bnei Brak to see the Chazon Ish. A several-hour trip in those days. And he came to Bnei Brak and he came into the Chazon Ish and he told the Chazon Ish what happened and tried to understand why was his tefillah a regular tefillah, what happened to his pilos, what happened to the expression of thank you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for what happened, for this great nace. The Chazon Ish was quiet for a few moments and then said to him, there's a special Yetzer Hara that's created to remove inspiration from someone after a nace. A special Yetzer Hara to make sure that the inspiration that you feel today, right after the nace, is no longer there tomorrow. It takes tremendous amount of work. And so the nace that I lived through, and others lived through that are watching this, and are so thankful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and thankful to Klal Yisrael for all the tefillos that were done on my behalf and on behalf of other Cholim, that saw a Yeshua. Yet, that is fleeting, and one has to work very hard to be able to keep that inspiration to continue throughout one's life, to show appreciation, and to live for every moment, that every moment is important and is kosher. But it's not only for those who were sick with COVID. Baruch Hashem, what about all the people, thousands and thousands and thousands of Yidden, Baruch Hashem, that didn't get sick? What about them? What about showing appreciation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for not getting sick? Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos and Perek Hey, the 10 things that happened in the Beis HaMikdash, 10 things that never happened, things that didn't take place. The rain never put out the fire, the Eish Tamid that was on the Mizbeach. Why does the Mishnah have to tell us list things that didn't happen? That just lists the Nisan that did happen. And Rav Cheskel Abremsky Zichron Livracha explained that things that not happening is also an ace. When something that could happen doesn't happen, then that's an ace, no different than the nace to the open miracle that happened in the Beis HaMikdash. When someone did not get sick, someone was Zocha Baruch Hashem to continue davening and learning and going about his daily life and didn't have to spend 6.5 weeks in a hospital and 3 weeks on a ventilating machine. How about the expression to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for that nace? They tell over a story about a Rav Victor Miller Zechron Livracha. There was a Yid who davened in a shul that he was very close to. And one morning after Shachos, he told him that he's leaving, saying goodbye. He's going to be away for a few days. He's going to London. And he's going for 2 days of business meetings that will spell the difference of his entire parnasa. He was able to get access to very, very important people, different companies that will allow his business to thrive. And that evening in Ma'ariv, Rav Victor Miller was very surprised to see that he came to shul for Ma'ariv. And he came over to Rav Avigdor Miller after davening, and he looked very upset. And the Rebbe asked him, what happened? Weren't you supposed to go to London? He says, yes, I left this morning with plenty of time, but there was an accident on the highway, and we were stuck in traffic, and whatever we tried did not work. And by the time I got to the airport, it was too late to board the plane, and I missed my flight. And when I missed my flight, there was no other flight to take that day, and therefore all my meetings had to be canceled. All the meetings that I worked hard to organize, to set up, all the contacts that I would have made are all gone. A terrible thing happened. And Avigdor Miller looked at him and says, let me ask you a question. What would happen if tomorrow morning you walked into shul and you heard that that plane that you were supposed to be on crashed in the sea and all 450 passengers perished? What would your reaction be? He says, Rebbe, are you kidding? I would make a Kiddush on Shabbos and say Nishmas and Hallel and thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for saving me by causing me to miss the plane. Avigdor Miller looked at him very seriously and says, Russia, why does it have to be that 450 people have to lose their lives before you could recognize and accept and appreciate of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for you? Obviously, by you having this traffic, going through this and missing the plane, it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's message to you that you didn't need to go. There was no need to go, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved you from some kind of disaster. And why don't you thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu without having the fact that 450 people would lose their lives? To recognize that everything that happens in our lives is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That we got sick. When someone gets sick, it's from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When someone didn't get sick, it's also from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And recognize and bring closer in Amunah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Dayan HaEmes and the Roifei Kol Basar, and to recognize our closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are so busy trying to understand COVID, why did it happen, how did it happen, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, inside shul, outside shul. We're so busy with all the particulars, but not the most important thing of allowing Amunah and Bitachon and HaKadosh Baruch Hu to enter our neshamas. The Ger Rebbe once said that there are 13 Ani Mamins, there are not 13 Ani Mavins. 13 things to say that we understand, that I understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu did this. That's not our way, that's not our role, that's not our responsibility. That's not our tafkid in life. Our tafkid in life is to see what the Eibishter brings to the world, how it applies to me, and strengthen our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amunah is something that we have to work on our entire life. Mashkiach, the mirror Mashkiach of Chatzkel, used to always share with his Talmidim that we were standing there one time when someone came over to ask the Chavetz Chaim about Amunah and Bitachon in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the level that one is supposed to have. And the Chavetz Chaim looked at the person with all seriousness and said to him, you should know, do you see the sun outside? The sun? The presence of the sun, do you feel it? Do you see it? That's how real the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to me in my life. No different than the sun. This has to instill in ourselves a greater level of Amunah, a greater level of appreciation of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned the world upside down in a moment, Keharafayin. Not only lives of the world, but individual lives. My life from one day busy, had appointments and meetings set up, and drushes to give, and shiurim to give, and the daf yomi shir to give. And in a moment's notice, all of a sudden, 6.5 weeks later, Hatzolah brings me back with a stretcher, brings me back home. Zocha to come back home. To appreciate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Roifei Kol Basar, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everything in this world that we have to understand. And why should we wait until Rahman's son we get sick? What about appreciating the nace that we didn't get sick? They tell over Rebbe, Bakasidish Rebbe, that one of his Hasidim, Kaidman, says, Rebbe, I struggle in Amunah. I have questions. And the Rebbe said, it's a very important thing. You think about it. You work on Amunah. I'm going to daven for you. And come back in a week. When he came back in a week, he said, Rebbe, no problem. No, I have no problem anymore. I believe with HaKadosh Baruch Hu with all my heart. He says, what happened during this week? So I'll tell you what happened, Rebbe. 3 days after I was here, I woke up with incredible pain. Incredible stomach. And I had no relief. And I was so scared that it was something so serious, some life-threatening. And I turned to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help me. Please take this away, this tsar, this pain. And a little while later, it went away. And I feel so much closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu now. And the Rebbe looked at him and smiled and says, so I see you didn't have a problem in Amunah. And he said as follows, Lo Emunah chasarta, ela ke'evim chasarta. You're the one missing Amunah in Hashem. You were missing a bellyache, a stomach ache. That's what you were missing. That brought out the fact that you have Amunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu like every single Yid has. To appreciate life. Rabbosai, we shouldn't have to be given back on the neshama. We shouldn't have to go through such a crisis, to feel alive again. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us back life. We should feel and appreciate life every single moment that we have, that we can wake up in the morning. It says in Yoina, that Yoina told the soldiers, told the sailors on the boat, on the ship, when the winds were threatening to topple the ship. The lashon of the pasuk is where Yonah tells them, lift me up and throw me into the sea. And we have Yudalev Chapsman in Ur Yoel. He asked the question, why did Yonah have to say, lift me up and throw me in the sea? Just say, throw me into the sea. Says Rabbi Yudalev Chapsman that Yonah knew that by saying, pick me up, it would take an extra moment. He'd be allowed to be alive. He'd be allowed to live one extra moment. And the value of one extra moment in life is so chashuv, is so precious, that Yonah actually told him in such a way to give himself one more minute, to appreciate every minute of life, of what life represents. I once heard from the Chafetz Chaim's nephew, Zechrono Tzaddik Livracha, Chaim Yitzchak Pupko. He said that he lived by the Chafetz Chaim in his home for 12 years. And one day, only a nephew could have the chutzpah to ask the Chafetz Chaim how old he is. The Chafetz Chaim didn't answer, and he asked him again how old he is. And the Chafetz Chaim didn't answer. And finally, a little bit later, the Chafetz Chaim gave him a bag of coins as a gift. The nephew took the bag, and he was holding it for a little while. And a little later, the Chafetz Chaim says, "How many coins are in the bag that I gave you?" And he says, "Tayer Fetter, uncle, it's not nice. It's not respectful to count what you get as a gift." The Chafetz Chaim says, "Life is a gift, and it's not nice to count. Don't ask me how old I am. It's not nice to count the gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you." Chafetz Chaim appreciate every single minute of life, and this is something that we have to do as well, to appreciate, to understand that it's a gift, and we should appreciate every single moment of our lives, and to try to understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu does things to us, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought this into the world. Is not our tafkid. It's not our tafkid. We're missing Iker Chasum in our Sefer. They tell over a story of where three friends were playing, and one of them said to the other one, "You have a pen in your pocket. I'll show you that I could take the pen out of your pocket and you won't even notice." He says, "Go ahead." And he was trying this way and trying that way and spent a few minutes, and each time his friend caught the pen. And finally he says to him, tells his other friend, "You see, he thought he could take the pen out of my pocket and he couldn't." And his friend says, "Yes, shaita, but meanwhile he took your wallet that you didn't notice." The Eibishter brought us into the world, was so busy with small things, with the pen, with the mass, without the mass. Why? Where? Politics. Focus on what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling us, the value of life, the chashivas of life. Every moment is precious. And we have to accomplish. We have to accomplish, not to understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu does these things. That's not our role, not our place. There was an elderly widow a widower that lived in Bnei Brak. And he was suffering very much. He had lost his beloved wife. And they came to Rav Shach and they told him that this person is suffering. He's so miserable. And the Chavetz Chaim walked into his house. One Leil Shabbos, he was sitting by himself at the table. And the Chavetz Chaim says, "Come, I'm also a widower. I'm also alone. Let's sit together." The Chavetz Chaim, the Rav Shach sat down and took out a bencher, and he opened up to the Pismon of Karibon, and he said as follows. He said, "Look and read the words. Lu yichya gevir shnin alpin, lo yael gevurteich b'chush benaya." Read those words, which means if a person would live even 1,000 years, he'll never be able to comprehend, to understand the cheshbonos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the constant chesed HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for us. But it is a chesed. Let's try not to understand, focus why. If Shach understood that this person was suffering, he was trying to understand why the Eibusher took his wife. We have no ability to understand if we lived 1,000 years. But we have to understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does is a tav of it, is for a purpose, and for the sole purpose of us becoming closer to Him. And that's our responsibility, what we have to do. To make valuable, to take the value every moment in life and make it worth, and do something with it. Because that other next moment, tomorrow, may never come. I want to conclude. Klal Yisrael is just still reeling from the Petira of the Rosh Hashiva, Harav David Feinstein Zechron Livracha. I want to share something that I heard from his brother Yibad L'Chaim, Rab Ruvain Shlita, who shared something that happened within the last days of Rav Moshe's life. Rav Moshe, for decades upon decades, Rav Moshe used to always make sure to daven in the yeshiva, walked a few blocks from his home on the FDR to come to the MTJ, to the yeshiva to daven. In the later years, it was too difficult for him, so they made a minyan in his home. And Shabbos, he would have a minyan in his home, in his small dining room. And later, when it became shvacha for him, so his seder on Shabbos was he would daven by himself early, and he'd be a kiddush, he would eat something, be able to take his medication, and then Rav Ruvain would come and bring a minyan to Lane, Kriyas HaTorah, and Musaf. And this was the anhaga for the last few years of Rav Moshe's life. It was Shabbos Parshas Zachor in 1986. And there was a big simcha celebration, Afrif in the yeshiva in MTJ, Tveres Yerushalayim, and most of the neighborhood was there. And Reuven was concerned that by the time everyone will leave and go to Rav Moshe, it will be too long, it will be too late, too hard for him, he's too shvach. So he figured that he wouldn't bring a minyan for Musaf, he'll just bring a minyan for Lane later in the afternoon. And when he came over to the house, Rav Moshe's house, Rav Moshe was agitated, was upset. "What do you mean? I always daven Musaf with a minyan on Shabbos. How can I not daven Musaf with a minyan?" And Rav Ruvain saw how agitated he was, how upset he was. He went around looking for stragglers to be able to put together a minyan, and he was able to put together 10 people, and they went to Lane and daven Musaf. Rav Moshe could daven Musaf with a minyan. Later that afternoon, as Rav Ruvain was having Shalosh Shudas with Rav Moshe turned to him and said in Yiddish, "Remember, we have to grab every mitzvah we can. We never know when we'll have another opportunity. If we'll have another opportunity, we have to grab it when we can." And Moshe grabbed in the Musaf that Shabbos. The following night, Rav Moshe Zatzal, the Pesach of Klal Yisrael, Gadol Hadar, was Niftar. That was the last Musaf of Moshe's life. The Chaparine, to be able to grab another mitzvah, grab another Musaf, another chakras, another tefillin, to be able to appreciate every single moment of our lives. And this is the responsibility that we have, a COVID reaction, a reaction of appreciating, that I should be able to continue to appreciate every moment of this life, of this world, of all HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chesed and brachos. It should continue the way I feel today. I should be able to continue for years to come. And one of the things that I did, personally I took upon myself, was that I took a notebook. And in the notebook I write, since I'm home from the hospital, I write down anything unusual. I don't mean just regular davening during the day, giving the daf yomi, any shiurim, any special talks of chizuk that I give, any shaduchim that I'm zocheh to make, any chizuk I'm able to give individuals, make shalom bayis between people. I write it in the book. And Be'ez Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lang yorn, I hope after 120 to go to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you gave me new life. Here, this is what I did with it. It wasn't for nothing. It wasn't for naught. It was for purpose. This is what I accomplished. This is what I hope to be able to do, and what every single person should be able to do who lived through COVID, whether sick or Baruch Hashem Azoka, to be healthy through COVID, to appreciate everything of life. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you spared me, you did a nace for me, and for that, I'm going to live the rest of my life to continue to do for Klal Yisrael, for Torah, for mitzvahs, for Eretz Yisrael, continue Be'ez Hashem until the coming of Mashiach. Will be zocheh to celebrate all the nisim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for us with the ultimate nace. Vo ovdim be'eretz Asher, v'shtachvu Hashem bar HaKodesh, v'Yerushalayim me'er v'yameinu. Amen.
Our next speaker is Rav Moshe Pluchak, a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva Derech Chaim, who also went through the Tekufas HaKovid and is somebody who has been a Rebbe for a number of years, being Madrich Talmidim, helping them understand everything going on in life, seeing things in a way that only a Rosh Yeshiva, only a person, a Rav, somebody of stature is able to see it, somebody who thinks Toradic, and he is such a person. It's a great schus and honor for us to have Rav Pluchak address us on giving us his perspectives on the COVID experience that he had.
A gute Woche. While it's very true that Corona ravaged the world, and particularly our community, and it sort of picked some of the tallest flowers in the orchard of Am Yisrael, of Klal Yisrael, the true embodiment of Doidi Yorad Legano Lilkoit B'Shoshanim. But tonight, if it's possible, I'd like to stress some of the very positive things that might be gleaned from this Magefa. And we have some of these ideas in our historical DNA. The Ramah, when he was a young man, in 1556, was part of the Krakow community. He was the Rav in Krakow, and a terrible pandemic struck Krakow. He had already lost his wife, his mother, and his grandmother to a previous pandemic. And he had to run to the town of Shidlov in order to quarantine and to stay safe. Everybody was dropping in Krakow. Yet the Ramah understood that he can't sit idle, he can't be a Yoshev Batel. And it was at that moment, it was Purim of that year, 1556, where the Ramah decided to write his famous Sefer, Mechir Yayin, on Megillas Esther, which is a very interesting fusion of Kabbalah and Drush. There was resilience there. The Ramah was a young man, but he wasn't going to be put down by a disease. He wasn't going to be put down by quarantine. A few years later, in Shin Lamed Ches, the Sefer HaChaim, which is a Musa Sefer, was written by Rav Chaim ben Betzalel of Friedberg, the Maharal's brother. I think it was the Maharal's younger brother. He too was the subject of a terrible disease which ravaged through Friedberg, which is a town in central Germany. And they had a quarantine for 2 months. He said his maid, and it seems like he had a very strong affection for her, his Meshereses died, his daughter almost died, and a child that lived with them almost died. He said, and he had to stay in the house with locked doors, sealed windows to make sure none of the air came in from the outside. They stayed like that for 2 months. And he didn't know what to do. He was going crazy. The quarantine was difficult. And he writes, at that point he thought, and he said, This is not the time to be a Yoshev Batel. There has to be some sort of something that he could do, and he decided to write all the Mussar Dahers that he would say to his Talmidim during his Shiurim. And they always wanted to hear them. They always wanted them written. And he said he didn't want to write them because it would take away from his Amelis and Torah. But now is the time to write this. And now he did write it. And it became something that was very valuable for Klal Yisrael, the Sefer HaChaim. What's interesting is that the Chidah, who was sent as a shliach to raise money from Hebron, when he got to northern Italy, this was the custom, it seems. They would quarantine anybody that came from the outside world. They would quarantine them for 40 days in a town called Lazaretto, or in a place called Lazaretto. And the Chidah was there for 40 days without Svarim. And it was at that point that he decided to write his famous Shem HaGedolim, which is biographical sketches of some of the greatest Rabbanim from the time of the Rishonim all the way to his day. And it's interesting, the Chidah writes, and there's a tremendous amount of learning there, because nothing the Chidah does is devoid of learning. There's a lot of rayas from Gemaras, from Rishonim, to a lot of the points that he makes. But the Chidah writes that it was an ode of Hakaras HaTov. After all, he benefited so much from these Gedolim. All their Sfarim and all their ideas and learning were things that benefited him and guided him through his life. He wanted to know who they were and let people know who they were, where they lived, what they accomplished, what their life was like. He felt that it was an ode of Hakaras HaTov. This resilience that we have in our spiritual DNA was very visible now during the time of COVID. All yeshivas that were shut down scrambled to figure out how to make Zoom programs, to make sure that Talmidim are learning. Every shul figured out a mahalach to make sure that minyanim are still functioning. There was a tremendous desire to stay operational, to stay functional. The resilience is an amazing thing. It's even though it's a very sad matzav, and it's a very tragic and traumatic situation, but it's important to recognize our abilities, and it's important to understand that many of us, in fact, Rov of us, did rise to the challenge. I'd like to also talk about a point regarding Hakaras HaTov, mentioning the Chidah's Hakaras HaTov. And I could say it with a Maisa. I once heard a story of a Avrech in Bnei Brak that was suffering with headaches. And he went to doctors, and after scans, it was apparent that he had an inoperable, benign tumor. True, the tumor wasn't malignant, but it would compromise his life, if not utterly destroy it. He had to have it removed, but there was no surgery or surgeon in Eretz Yisrael capable of removing this tumor. He looked into it, and he located one possibility. Was a doctor in Boston who seemed to have developed a gamma knife, which is a radiation type of knife that has the ability to bend in difficult spots and remove this inoperable tumor. He made an appointment, and he decided he was going to go visit this doctor. Obviously, Kupat Cholim and the national insurance would not pay for something that was so cumbersome and revolutionary and might not even be the standard of medicine. So it was probably a $70,000 to $100,000 surgery that would not be covered. His wife asked him what he thinks he's going to use for money to pay for this surgery. He said that's not his problem. He's going to go. For the next few days, he's going to raise some money to cover the tickets to Boston, and the surgery will be successful, and Be'ezer Hashem, he'll throw himself at the mercy of his American brothers, and he'll raise the money to cover the medical bills. He had 2 weeks till he flies to Boston, and he decided in those 2 weeks to work through the sugya, whether you say the bracha of she nosan mechochmasei lebasav adam. This bracha is said on wise people. If it's a wise person from Me'amenu, so we will say shecholak mechochmasei lebasav adam. If it's from Meumas ha'olam, we would say shenosan mechochmasei lebasav adam. Now, he wasn't clear and he wasn't sure whether this person deserved such a blessing. So he decided to go into the sugya and go around to different poskim and ask them what they thought about this specific question. Eventually, the conclusion was that he makes the bracha, but without the Shem Malchus. He shouldn't mention Hashem's name. Comes to Boston, he does all the intake questionnaires. The nurse interviews him. She sees him a candidate to see this doctor. And after a few hours in the waiting room, the doctor finally calls him in. Mr. Schwartz, please come in. I'd like to see you now. And he shakes his hand. And Mr. Schwartz, this younger man from Bnei Brak, says, Baruch shenasan mechachmasei lebasar v'dam. He mumbles it. He doesn't say it loudly. It's barely audible. The doctor looks at him and says, What did you say? What did you say? Oh, he says, it's a religious practice. Don't pay no heed to it. No, he says, I'm a very cultured person. I'm well-traveled. I've seen different cultures all over the world. I'd really like to know what you just said and what you did. He says, if you want to, I'll tell you. He says, look, as Jews, we're trained to notice God's presence everywhere in the world. If we see mountains, we make a special blessing on a mountain. We eat a fruit, we make a special blessing. A vegetable, we make a different blessing. When we eat bread, that's another unique blessing. Wine has its own blessing completely. Lightning has a blessing. Thunder has a blessing. Oceans have a blessing. Everywhere we turn, we try to notice Hashem's presence. We try to notice God's presence. And we dot it with blessings which mark our recognition and our thanks to God. He says, look, you're a very wise man. You developed a very, very important technique. One that's a very strong technique for life-saving. And it was deemed by the rabbis in Israel that you deserve a special blessing of thanks to God for putting you in this world. So when I saw you, I made that blessing, as is our tradition. And the doctor looked at him and he says, Mr. Schwartz, I've never been so humbled by such a compliment, by a compliment like that. He says, come in, let's talk. And they're talking, and he's doing his own particular intake. And as they're in the middle of a discussion, the nurse pokes her head in and she says, Doctor, Mr. Schwartz doesn't have any coverage. I forgot to ask him. I'm sorry, I guess we'll be referring him to clinic. And the doctor looks at him and she says, no. Mr. Schwartz is my guest. The surgery is on us. The hospitalization is on us. Don't send him anywhere. He's my personal guest. Now, it's an understanding that Hakaras HaTov is a value for Hakaras HaTov, but it's also an understanding that Hakaras HaTov, recognizing the Rebbeinu Shalom, his gifts and what he does for us, and the constancy of his gifts, also affords us the ability to get more. When someone appreciates, he's in a very good spot to get more, and I know that from a Gemara. The Gemara tells us in Bab Metzia that Eliyahu have a shchiach b'mesifta devei Rebbe. Eliyahu Hanavi, it seems, was a Talmud and went to learn in Rebbe's yeshiva. Yom echad have Rosh Yarcha. One day it was Rosh Chodesh and have Noga. Eliyahu came late for the studies and Rebbe asked him, Amai konogis mar, why are you so late? And Eliyahu told him a story. He says, listen, I went up to Olam Haba. I woke up Avram Avinu. I gave him to wash his hands. He davened, I put him back to sleep. Then Yitzchak, I did the same. Then Yaakov, it took me a lot of time. So Rebbe asked him, why don't you do them all together at one time? Why do you have to do each one individually? He says, nah, if I have them all together, they might daven for Mashiach, and Mashiach could come b'leizmaneh. There's a certain time, there's an ace for Mashiach. If they, with their tefillas, would be together, they would overpower any type of gzar din, and Mashiach would come when it's not. So Rebbe asked him, he says, Yesh lanu medugmasam ba'olam hazeh? Do we have any candidate similar to the others that could overpower the Gzeira? And Eliyahu said, yes, Rav Chia Ubanav. Rav Chia and his sons have that strength. So it says, Goza Rebbe Tainisa. Rebbe made a tainis, and he brought Rav Chia and his sons down, and he asked them to daven in unison, to give it all they have. When they said, Mashiv Ruach Umayrid Ageshem, together, Noshav Zika. Wind started blowing. Very strong, forceful winds. When they said Moirid Ageshem Osa Mitra, then the rain started coming, torrential rain. They were ready to say Mechayim Mesim, and it says Rogash Ara. The land, the earth started shaking. There was some sort. Now, they didn't ask for anything. All they did was they marked and recognized the Rebbeinu Shalom's constant Mashiv Ruach, the Rebbeinu Shalom's constant Moirid Ageshem, and they got it. Because Hakaras HaTov, besides just an odyssey of thanks, also gives a person a future. It's a bakosh ala os. It's a hoidah ala ovar, but it's also a bakosh ala osid, and it affords the person to be in the spot, in a position to get more. What Corona did for many of us was it allowed us to be makirei toiv. Like Rav Ginsburg Shlita said before, it allowed us to be makirei toiv, those of us that didn't get sick, those of us that got sick and got better. It allowed us to recognize the fleeting beauty of every second, the beauty of every minute, the chshivas of every mitzvah, the fact that we still have the ability to do mitzvahs. It allowed us all of that. It afforded us all of that. So it's important to recognize resilience, hakaras hatoiv. But yet, it would be important to underscore a cautionary note, one or two cautionary notes. And the Gemara tells us, and these are psukim in Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed Vav, the Gemara tells, the psukim tell us that in the 4th year of Yehoyakim, Hashem called Yirmiyah and told him to write a Megillah. Chazal tell us this was Megillas Eicha. And this was 18 years before the Churban. This was a very bad king. Yehoyakim was considered one of the worst kings of the Malchei Yehuda. And the idea was that Klal Yisrael would hear this Megillah, and they would hear Hashem, what Hashem his lashon was, Asher ani choishev la'asos lehem, what I'm intending to do to them. Ulai yeshuvu midarkam, maybe they'll do tshuva. So it was established that there should be a tzom, a big fast, and Baruch ben Neriah, Yirmiyah's Talmud, the one who was the scribe for the Megillah, read the Megillah publicly. One of Yehoyakim's ministers was there, present, and he heard the Megillah, and it was atrocious. The future was very bleak. And he went and told some of the other ministers with an effort to figure out what to do. Is this worthy of being brought to Yehoyakim? Is it treasonous? How do we deal with this exactly? Eventually it gets to Yehoyakim. Vayishlach Yehoyakim es Yehudi ben Netanya. Yehoyakim sends Yehudi, the son of Netanya, this is his close minister, to retrieve the Megillah. And to read the Megillah to himself, to Yehoyakim, and to all the Sarim, and they'll judge this. They'll gauge whether it's treason or whether it's not. And it says, V'hamelach Yoshev bebeis ha'choref, the king was sitting in the winter house, b'chodesh haTshi, it was in the 9th month, which is Kislev, our month right now, it was cold. V'och asher lefanav mevayeres, the large fireplace which was in front of him was roaring. He had a very warm fire that he was sitting and warming himself by. So it says, Yehudi is reading the Megillah. Vayehi kikroi Yehudi, shloisha dlases v'arba. After Yehudi read 3 or 4 stanzas. So it says, Yikraeh betar haSefer. The king started ripping the Megillah with the scribe's knife. V'hashlech el toicha eish asher ala'och. And he threw the Megillah into the fire, which was on top of the fireplace. Ad toim kol ha-Megillah, until the Megillah was completely incinerated. Ala eish asher ala'och. Until the Megillah was completely incinerated. And none of the soldiers were afraid. It didn't grab them at all with fear. There was no fright. They didn't rip their clothes. After all, a holy Megillah was just burnt publicly. The desecration of Hashem's name. There was no pachad. There was no kriya. The Gemara Moed Katan tells us, what was this Megillah exactly? It was Megillas Eicha. And they came to the king, and the Shlosh v'Arba'ad losses are as follows. Yehudi reads the first stanza. It says, Eicha Yoshva Bodod, Ha'ira Bas Yam, Hoisa Kalmana. Look, this metropolis, this tremendous city, the capital of the world, Yerushalayim, is now Kalmana. It was once amazing, now it's Kalmana. And the pasuk concludes, Hoisa Lamas, it now pays taxes to everybody. And the king listens and he says, it's taka tragic, but Va'ano Malka, I'm still the king. It doesn't really bother me. It's true that we have a demotion, we fall from grace, but Va'ano Malka, I'm still the king. They read the second pasuk. The pasuk says, Bochai tivke balayla, v'dimasa alechya. The mood in Yerushalayim is going to be so traumatic, devastating. They'll cry by v'dimasa alechya. Ein la menachem mikol hayaveh. None of her friends are going to come to help her. There's going to be isolation, loneliness. Kol re'eh bogduba. He looks and he listens. He says, it's sad, but it doesn't affect me. I'm in my tower. I'm in my palace. I have my amenities. I have what I need. It's not affecting me personally. Va'ano malka. They tell him, Golsa Yehuda me'oini u'meroi v'avoida. Yehuda is going to have a large exile. There's going to be a mass exodus. People are going to leave because they're going to be looking for work. And it's going to, v'hi yoshva b'goyim, they're going to sit and migrate in other places. And kol reitfei sigur bein hamitzarim, they're going to be abused. They're going to be somewhat tormented. He says it's true, an exile, an exodus is sad for a country. It is somewhat devastating. It's bad for morale. But Va'ano Malka, I'm still the king. I have nothing to worry about. He personalized everything. I have nothing to worry. They tell him the fourth bias, which is the Delis Haravi. They tell him, listen, Darkei Tzir Navelis. The roads are going to be empty. There'll be no tourism. Mibli boye moyed. Nobody's going to come. Nobody's going to come for Aliyah L'Regel. The standard revenue that you're looking to rely on, it's not going to happen. Kol Sha'arei Shaimemin. The gates are going to fall into disrepair. It's going to be devastating. There's no income. Everybody's leaving. He says, Va'ano Malka. He says, but again, it doesn't bother me. I'm not bothered. I'm the king. They finally tell him, but you should know, Hoyu Tzareh Leroish. The enemy is going to be the leader. The enemy is going to run this place. Enemies are going to... He said, who said this? Ki Hashem hoigal roiv b'shah. Hashem is the one that decreed this because of all its sins. Now that already touched him. In that case, what he did was he got rid of the Megillah. He destroyed the Megillah. He burnt it completely. The emes is, that's the nature of individuals. We all know it. We all understand it. We hear somebody had a heart attack. Our first question is, did he smoke? Was he fat? Is there heart conditions in the family? That's our way of systematizing the same concept of Va'ano Malka. We hear somebody had cancer. So we right away do some sort of a mental gymnastic to figure out why they, not us. It's always like that. And I think that if COVID showed us anything, it is the bankruptcy of this idea of Va'ano Malka. It could strike anyone. It could strike anywhere. It doesn't have a specific pattern. A lot of us still say Va'ano Malka, but I think it's very important to underscore this cautionary note that we shouldn't be comfortable and we shouldn't be complacent. Va'ano Malka is a shrek l'chataina. And still, I want to end with one nekuda over here. Everybody's familiar with the Meshech Chochmah Bechukoisai. Rav Meir Simcha talks about the patterns of migration through Klal Yisrael's history. He says, what happens to us as a nation is we move to a country, we get very complacent, we set roots there, we have moistus there, and he says a lashon about Germany in his time. He said, Ad ki yachshavu ki Berlin Yerushalayim, till people start thinking Berlin is Jerusalem. He says, and we forget Geula, we forget Hashem, we forget everything, and then a wind comes in the form of a devastating gezerah, in the form of a devastating situation, and it shakes us out of our complacency. It removes our comfort, and we go somewhere else. We migrate, and then again 100, 200 years, until again our complacency completely strips us of our identity and what we're supposed to be living for, and the people we're supposed to be, and what we're supposed to represent. And again, this terrible wind comes. Maybe it could be said that we're here in America for many years, and maybe it could be said that we've grown somewhat complacent, but could be, even though this was a tragic wind, and it definitely destroyed Rosh Yeshivas, Rabbanim, it destroyed Mechanchem, it destroyed so many different people from so many walks of life, but still, maybe it's just a gentle reminder that we're supposed to pay attention to what our legacy is. We're supposed to pay attention to what our mantra is. And we could buckle under and we could do what we're supposed to do and we could avert major tragedy. Maybe this is the Chesed Hashem. And we should be zoicha, that we should internalize the idea of resilience, to understand that whatever it is that was thrown at us, we're able to somehow reform and evolve and do what we're supposed to do, like some of the greatest people in our history. The idea of Akaras HaTov, and also the idea of understanding what our call is. And we should be zeicha to see Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mehera v'yameinu. Amen.
I lift my bow to play, but the melody just fades away. A tune can't come together on its own. Joined by flute so sweet, the horns give strength, drums that beat, music music isn't meant to stand alone. Challenge comes my way, but the resolution's far away. I can't solve this problem on my own. Now a movement stands alongside me to hold my hand, accomplishing what I can't do alone. We all band in unity, all our voices blend exquisitely, moving the world with harmony. Stand as one community, common goals bring opportunity to change the world for you and me. We're a movement in time, and the time has come to join as one. Our movement moves mountains once too high. We're a movement in time, and the time has come for everyone to join us in our movement in time. We're a movement in time, and the time has come to join as one. Our movement moves mountains once too high. We're a movement in time, and the time has come for everyone to join us in our movement in time.
Agudas Yisrael was formed by the Gedolei Yisrael to deal with the challenges of that time, but also to deal with the challenges of this time and the next time, because the challenges always change. But what remains constant is that in order effectively to deal with them, we need a guf tziburi, a koach harabim, headed by the Gedolei Yisrael. It makes it important and imperative for each and every one of us to be part of that guf tziburi, to be part of that koach harabim, thereby effectuate the vision of the Gedolei Yisrael, who established this as a movement in time.
So lift your bows and play, let the music carry us away, raising us to heights we've never known. Stand up on your feet, scale each mountain to the beat. Klal Yisrael must not act alone. When challenge comes our way, together we won't be afraid. Agudo Achas, never on our own. Now a movement stands, strength in numbers, time we spend.